Elvis Presley was not afraid of crowds. He was not afraid of cameras. He was not afraid of screaming fans or flashing lights. But this envelope made his hands pause. It was late. The room was quiet in a way Elvis rarely experienced anymore. No music playing, no voices outside the door. Just a lamp, a table, and a stack of letters he usually never touched himself. Most of them were harmless. Most of them were lies. Most of them didn't matter. This one did. The envelope was plain. No decoration, no fan club stamp, just his name written carefully, like the person who wrote it didn't want to be noticed, but wanted to be understood. Elvis stared at it longer than necessary, because something about it felt personal. When he finally opened it, the paper inside was thin, folded once, the kind of paper people use when they don't expect a second chance. The first line stopped him cold, not because it was angry, not because it was threatening, but because it knew him. It spoke to a version of Elvis that no longer existed in public, a boy before the crown, a voice before the contracts, a man before he learned how dangerous truth could be. As his eyes moved down the page, his breathing slowed. This wasn't a fan letter. This wasn't admiration. This was memory. And memory, when written down, becomes evidence. Outside that room, Elvis Presley was the most powerful entertainer in the world. Inside it, he was a man holding something that could ruin everything. Because if this letter ever became public, it wouldn't just embarrass him. It wouldn't just damage his career. It would expose the lie his entire empire was built on. Elvis folded the letter halfway through reading it, not because he was done, because he already knew where it was going, and he didn't want to see it finished. To the world, Elvis was unstoppable. Every movie sold, every song charted, every appearance controlled. He was protected by managers, lawyers, studios, men whose job was to make sure nothing real ever reached the surface. But this letter slipped past all of them. Because it didn't attack the king, it spoke to the man. And that was the problem. Fame had taught Elvis many things: how to smile when tired, how to stay silent when angry, how to perform happiness even when it wasn't there. What fame never taught him was how to face the past. The letter reminded him of a promise, a moment, a choice, something he had walked away from when the world offered him everything in exchange for silence. The scariest part wasn't that the letter existed. The scariest part was this: Elvis knew the letter was right. He could destroy it, burn it, tear it into pieces, and let the ash disappear like so many other things in his life. That was the safe choice. That was the expected choice. That was the choice everyone around him would make. But once the truth is written down, it doesn't stay quiet. And as Elvis sat there staring at the folded paper, one question echoed louder than any crowd he had ever faced. If he ignored this letter, would he keep his crown or lose himself forever? He placed the letter on the table. He didn't burn it. He didn't answer it. Not yet. Because this letter wasn't asking for forgiveness. It wasn't asking for money. It was asking for something far more dangerous: honesty. And Elvis Presley had built his entire life learning when not to give it. Elvis did not sleep that night.
The letter stayed on the table, folded, unmoving, but its presence filled the room like a second heartbeat. Every sound felt louder, every thought felt heavier. He had stood on stages in front of thousands without fear, yet a few written lines had undone him more completely than any crowd ever could. By morning, he already knew this letter wasn't a moment, it was a crack. And cracks don't stay small for long. To the outside world, Elvis Presley woke up as usual. Assistants knocked, schedules were read, meetings were planned, smiles were expected. The machines started moving again, perfectly oiled, perfectly rehearsed. That was the genius of the Elvis empire. It didn't care what the man inside felt, as long as the image stayed intact. And for years, Elvis had played his part. He had learned early that success came with conditions. You sing this way, not that way. You wear this, not that. You don't speak about certain things. You don't remember certain people. You don't ask questions once the money starts flowing. The crown was heavy, yes, but it was also profitable, and everyone around him depended on it staying exactly where it was. The letter threatened that balance, not because it contained scandal alone, but because it challenged the rules Elvis had been trained to live by. It reminded him that before contracts and cameras, he had been someone who believed his voice meant something real. Someone who thought music was truth, not strategy. The letter didn't demand he go public. It demanded something worse. It demanded he admit the lie to himself. As the day moved on, Elvis carried that knowledge with him into every room. Studio executives spoke about numbers. Managers spoke about schedules. No one noticed how quiet he had become. No one asked why his answers were shorter, his smile slower. Because no one wanted to know. Truth was expensive. Silence was cheap and reliable. At one point, Elvis caught his reflection in a mirror. The hair, the clothes, the posture. He looked exactly like Elvis Presley, but behind the image, something felt hollow. The letter had peeled back the performance just enough for him to see the cost of it. Every time he had chosen safety over honesty, every time he had let others decide who he was allowed to be. The danger of the letter wasn't exposure, it was awakening. Because once a man sees the cage, pretending it isn't there becomes impossible. Elvis understood now why it had arrived when it did. Not at the beginning of his career, when he still believed in control. Not at the end, when regret would be easy to explain. It came now, when he had everything the world said he wanted, and nothing that felt like freedom. He thought about burning it again. That temptation returned often. A single match, and the problem would disappear. No proof, no consequences, just another secret buried under success. But deep down, Elvis knew destruction wouldn't erase what the letter had already done. The words were inside him now. They had already rewritten something he couldn't undo. What frightened him most was how alone this decision felt. Everyone around him had a stake in his silence. Managers needed stability. Studios needed reliability. Fans needed a fantasy. No one needed the truth. And yet the truth had found him anyway, slipping through the cracks of control like smoke. As night came again, Elvis sat with the letter for a second time. He unfolded it fully now. He read every line. He didn't rush. He didn't stop halfway.
And when he reached the end, there was no anger left in him, only clarity. This wasn't about the past trying to hurt him. This was about the present, asking him who he really was. He realized then that whether he answered the letter or not, it had already changed him. Silence would no longer be ignorance. It would be a choice. And choices, once seen clearly, leave marks that fame cannot hide. Elvis folded the paper carefully and placed it back into the envelope. Tomorrow, the world would still see the king, the smile, the legend, the control. But something irreversible had begun, because the most dangerous thing that can happen to a man like Elvis Presley is not scandal. It is remembering himself. Elvis did not read the letter again the next morning, but he felt it everywhere, in the silence between questions, in the pauses before answers, in the way his chest tightened whenever someone said the word future. The letter had done something dangerous. It had shifted time. The past was no longer behind him, and the future no longer felt guaranteed. Everything had collapsed into this one moment where memory and consequence stood face to face. He knew now that the most important part of the letter was not what it said, but who had written it, because only one kind of person could write words like those. Someone who had known him before the crown, before the machine, before Elvis Presley became a product. He stared at the envelope again, this time focusing on the handwriting. It was careful, but not elegant, confident, but not proud. The letters leaned slightly to the right, like someone who thought before acting, but acted anyway. Elvis traced the ink with his finger, and suddenly the memory hit him. Not a clear image, not a face, just a feeling. Heat, dust, a voice laughing without fear. A time when promises were spoken easily because consequences were still far away. His breath caught. He knew this handwriting, or at least, he knew the person behind it. That realization scared him more than anything written inside, because this wasn't a stranger trying to profit. This wasn't blackmail. This was someone who had waited.
someone who had watched him rise from a distance, carrying a truth that had grown heavier with every record sold and every lie repeated. The letter wasn't rushed, it wasn't desperate, it had been patient, and patience meant intention. As the day unfolded, Elvis tried to distract himself. Music sessions, conversations, jokes. But the more noise he surrounded himself with, the louder the question became. Why now? Why after all these years? The timing was too precise to be accidental. The letter hadn't come when he was vulnerable. It hadn't come when he was struggling. It had come when he was stable, protected, untouchable. That meant the writer wasn't trying to destroy him. They were trying to wake him up. Elvis remembered something the letter mentioned only briefly, almost casually. A night, a conversation, a promise spoken like it would last forever. At the time, it had felt small, personal, private. But reading it now, he understood what he had refused to see back then. That promise wasn't just emotional, it was moral. And breaking it hadn't just changed someone else's life, it had reshaped his own. The suspense wasn't in what would happen if the letter became public. Elvis could already imagine that chaos. The headlines, the shock, the explanations that would never fully satisfy anyone. The real suspense was quieter.
More dangerous, what would happen if he did nothing? What would happen if he kept living as if this reminder had never arrived? The letter had turned inaction into a form of betrayal. That evening, Elvis finally did something he had avoided for years. He dismissed everyone early. No entourage, no advisors, no voices telling him what was smart or safe. Just him and the letter, and the truth waiting between them. He poured himself a drink but didn't touch it. His hands weren't shaking, but his thoughts were. He unfolded the paper again and read it slowly, line by line, as if listening instead of seeing. Near the end of the letter, there was a sentence that hadn't fully registered before. It wasn't angry, it wasn't demanding. It simply said that the writer had never expected him to answer. They only wanted him to remember. That line hit harder than any threat could have, because it meant the letter wasn't about forcing a response. It was about placing responsibility back where it belonged. Elvis realized then that the person who wrote this wasn't asking for justice. They had already accepted the past. This letter was a mirror, not a weapon, and mirrors are dangerous to men who survive by performance, because once you see yourself clearly, every role feels false. He stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the world moved as if nothing had changed. Cars passed, lights flickered. People lived their ordinary lives untouched by the private war happening inside one man's chest. Elvis wondered how many of them believed fame meant freedom, how many thought power erased regret. If only they knew how heavy it felt to be seen by someone who remembered you honestly. For the first time, Elvis considered replying. Not publicly, not dramatically, just a letter, just words. No managers, no cameras, no consequences anyone else could measure. But even that small act felt enormous, because writing back meant admitting the truth had power. And once you give truth power, it starts asking for more. The suspense tightened around him. If he answered, there was no guarantee the story would end. If he stayed silent, there was no guarantee it would stay buried. The letter had created a future where every path carried risk, and Elvis understood something critical in that moment. The danger was no longer the writer. The danger was what this choice would turn him into. He folded the letter once more, slower this time, almost respectfully. He placed it somewhere safer than before, not hidden, but not visible. A place where he would have to remember it existed, because pretending it was gone was no longer possible. As he turned off the light, one thought followed him into the dark, steady and unavoidable. The person behind that ink had waited years to remind him of who he was, and now the waiting was over. The next move belonged to Elvis Presley alone. Elvis tried to move forward, but the story kept pulling him backward. Every sound reminded him of something unfinished. Every quiet moment carried the weight of that letter, now no longer just paper, but a presence. He had placed it away, yet it followed him like a shadow that knew his shape better than he did. This was no longer about curiosity. This was about consequence, because the more he thought about the writer, the clearer the memory became, and with it the promise he had once believed would never matter again. Long before the contracts, before the managers, before the rules, Elvis had been reckless with his words. He spoke promises the way young men do, believing intention was enough to make them permanent. That night came back to him in fragments. A small room, heat clinging to the walls, a voice asking him not to forget where he came from. At the time, he had laughed it off, not out of cruelty, but out of certainty. Certainty that success would never demand sacrifice. Certainty that he could carry everyone with him when the world finally noticed. But success does not travel lightly. It demands choices, and choices demand losses. Elvis had learned that lesson too late. When the phone started ringing and doors began opening, there was no moment where he consciously decided to abandon that promise. It simply became inconvenient, then dangerous, then impossible. Silence replaced explanation, and time did the rest of the work. Or so he thought. The letter shattered that illusion. It revealed that time had not erased the promise, it had preserved it. And now, years later, it had returned not as anger, but as reminder. That was what made it unbearable. If the letter had accused him, he could have defended himself. If it had demanded something, he could have refused. But it did neither. It simply stated what had been said, what had been believed, and what had been lost in between. Elvis began to see his career differently. Every controlled interview, every carefully chosen answer, every moment where he had let someone else speak for him. He told himself it was necessary, that this was the price of staying relevant. But beneath those justifications lived a quieter truth. He had been afraid that honesty would make him small again, afraid that the world loved the image more than the man, afraid that if he stepped out of line even once, everything would be taken away. The suspense of the letter now lived in his body. It tightened his chest before meetings, it slowed his steps backstage. He wondered who else might know. He wondered if the writer had copies. He wondered if this was the beginning of something he could no longer control. But deeper than all those fears was one he had never allowed himself to name. What if the letter was not trying to destroy him, but to free him? That possibility frightened him more than scandal ever could. Freedom meant responsibility. It meant standing alone without the shield of contracts and excuses. It meant accepting that the boy who had made that promise had grown into a man who failed to keep it. Fame could soften many things, but it could not soften that realization. As days passed, Elvis noticed something else changing. His voice sounded different to him, not weaker, but heavier, as if every note carried memory along with melody. He wondered if audiences could hear it too, if they sensed the tension behind the performance, or if they only heard what they wanted to hear, the way they always had. The king on stage, the man hidden behind him. Late one night, Elvis sat alone again, the letter back in his hands. He read it not as a threat, but as a timeline. Before, after, and everything in between. The writer never once blamed him directly. That omission spoke louder than any accusation. It suggested understanding. It suggested patience. It suggested that this letter was not about revenge. It was about closure. That realization sharpened the suspense, because closure requires participation.
It cannot happen in silence. And Elvis knew now that the letter would not leave him alone until he made a decision. Not a public one, a personal one. Either he would continue pretending that the promise had never mattered, or he would finally admit that it had shaped everything that came after. The danger had shifted. This was no longer about exposure to the world. This was about exposure to himself. And for a man who had spent years performing certainty, doubt was the most destabilizing force of all. Elvis folded the letter again, but this time he did not put it away. He kept it close, as if acknowledging its right to be there. One thought repeated in his mind, slow and relentless. If a single forgotten promise could return after all these years, what else had he buried that might still be waiting? And if this letter was only the beginning, then the life he thought he understood was far more fragile than he had ever allowed himself to believe. Elvis understood now that the letter itself was not the greatest danger. The real danger lived in the people around him. The men who had built their lives, their money, their power on the version of Elvis that never hesitated, never doubted, never looked back. These were not evil men. They were practical men. Men who believed control was the same thing as protection. Men who had turned a poor boy with a voice into a global machine and expected gratitude in return. To them, silence was not cruelty, it was policy. Every meeting reminded Elvis of this truth. Conversations sounded friendly, but underneath them ran a current of warning. Stay predictable, stay profitable, stay quiet. No one said it directly because they didn't have to. The rules had been written long ago, and Elvis had followed them for so long they felt invisible. But now, with the letter pressing against his awareness, he could finally see the shape of the cage. He imagined what would happen if these men ever read those words. The panic would not be emotional, it would be logistical. Lawyers would appear, explanations would be drafted, strategies would be designed to erase a problem before it reached daylight. The letter would not be discussed as truth or memory, it would be discussed as risk, and risks in their world were eliminated without sentiment. That knowledge tightened the suspense around every step he took. Elvis began to realize that this story was no longer only his. Too many people depended on his obedience. Too many livelihoods rested on the idea that the past was sealed and harmless. The letter threatened to reopen doors they had locked carefully, methodically, without ever asking who might still be inside. He tested the edges of that control in small ways. A delayed answer, a canceled meeting, a moment of silence where a smile was expected. Each time, the response was subtle but immediate. Concern masked as care, questions framed as protection, reminders of how much he had to lose. No one accused him directly, but the message was clear. Stability mattered more than honesty. The suspense deepened when Elvis realized something else. The men around him didn't just fear scandal, they feared unpredictability. They feared Elvis thinking for himself. Because once a man begins questioning one rule, he eventually questions them all. And that was unacceptable. The empire could survive rumors. It could not survive a king who stopped obeying. The letter had made Elvis unpredictable. That was its true power.
It had shifted something inside him that could not be measured or managed. And for the first time, he saw how fragile his position actually was. Not because he lacked fame, but because fame was conditional. Love came with instructions. Applause came with expectations. Freedom was never part of the deal. Late one afternoon, Elvis overheard a conversation meant to be private, his name spoken carefully, his behavior discussed quietly. The tone was calm, but the meaning was sharp. They were watching him, measuring him, deciding how much deviation they would tolerate. That was when the suspense reached a new level. The letter was no longer just a personal burden, it was a ticking clock. If he answered it, even privately, he risked creating a paper trail, a connection, proof that the past was not buried as deeply as everyone believed. If he stayed silent, he risked becoming something hollow, a man who knew the truth and chose comfort anyway. Both paths carried loss. Both paths demanded sacrifice. The difference was what kind of man he would be afterward. Elvis felt anger rise in him, slow and unfamiliar. Not rage, but clarity. He realized how carefully his life had been narrowed, how many decisions had been made for him under the name of safety, how often he had been told that this was the only way things could be. The letter challenged that lie. It suggested another possibility, a dangerous one, that even a king could choose differently. The suspense was no longer about exposure, it was about resistance. How long could he carry this truth without acting on it? How long before the pressure forced his hand one way or the other? He felt the weight of expectation pressing in from all sides. Fans wanted the fantasy, managers wanted control, history wanted a simple story. No one wanted complexity. No one wanted the man behind the myth. That night, Elvis sat alone again, the letter beside him, unopened this time. He didn't need to read it anymore. Its words had etched themselves into him. He thought about the writer and the patience it must have taken to wait all these years. He thought about the courage it took to send something knowing it might be ignored. And he wondered which required more strength, speaking the truth or living with it in silence. For the first time, Elvis imagined a future where the letter was never resolved. No reply, no confrontation, just a quiet understanding that some truths exist without witnesses. That future felt safe and unbearably empty. He also imagined the opposite, a future where he acknowledged the past, even if only once, even if only in ink. That future felt terrifying and strangely alive. The suspense reached its sharpest edge when Elvis admitted something to himself he had never allowed before. The men around him could manage his schedule. They could manage his image. They could manage his voice. But they could not manage his conscience. The letter had awakened that part of him, and now it refused to be quiet. He picked up the envelope and turned it over in his hands. He didn't open it. He didn't hide it. He simply held it, feeling its weight, understanding its cost. Outside, the world still believed in the king. Inside, a man stood at the edge of disobedience. And the most dangerous thing was no longer the letter itself. It was the realization that he might be ready to defy the empire built on his silence. The night Elvis finally made the decision did not feel dramatic.
There was no thunder, no sudden clarity, no cinematic sign telling him this was the point of no return. It felt ordinary, and that was what made it terrifying. Because ordinary moments are where real lives change, quietly and without permission. He sat alone again, the letter in front of him, and for the first time since it arrived, he stopped thinking about consequences. Not contracts, not headlines, not the men who watched his every move. He thought only about himself, stripped of title and expectation, and that version of Elvis felt dangerously honest. He unfolded the letter slowly, not with fear this time, but with acceptance. The words did not change. They never had. What changed was the way they landed. Where once they felt like an accusation, now they felt like an invitation. Not to confess publicly, not to destroy the image everyone loved, but to acknowledge the truth privately, in a way that could no longer be undone. Because acknowledgement, once made, reshapes everything that follows. Elvis understood something crucial in that moment. The letter was never meant to expose him. It was meant to give him a choice. And every day he delayed was still a choice, just one made out of fear instead of intention. That realization tightened something inside him. He had spent his life reacting to forces larger than himself, letting momentum carry him forward. But this was different. This required action, however small, however hidden. He reached for a blank sheet of paper. The movement was simple, but it felt heavier than any performance he had ever given. Writing meant commitment. Writing meant proof. Writing meant crossing a line that silence had protected for years. His hand hovered for a moment, not shaking, but hesitant, because once the first word appeared, there would be no pretending this was just a thought. The suspense lived in that pause. The world outside remained unchanged. People slept. Cars passed. Fame continued uninterrupted. But inside that room, the distance between the man he had been and the man he was becoming narrowed to the width of a pen tip. Elvis inhaled slowly and began to write. Not explanations, not excuses, just truth, measured and careful, stripped of performance. He did not promise to fix the past. He did not ask for forgiveness he was not entitled to. He acknowledged what had happened, what he had failed to protect, and the cost of his silence. Each sentence felt like removing a layer of armor he had worn for too long. Vulnerability was not something his world rewarded, but in that moment, it felt necessary, even inevitable. As the words formed, Elvis felt an unfamiliar calm, not relief, not joy. Calm, the kind that comes when resistance finally ends. The suspense did not disappear. If anything, it sharpened, because now there was something tangible, a response that could be discovered, a connection that could be traced, a future that no longer depended entirely on pretending. He finished the letter without rereading it. He folded it carefully and placed it inside an envelope. His name was not enough this time. He wrote it as a man, not a legend. No flourish, no image, just honesty in ink. That act alone felt rebellious. For a long moment, he stared at the envelope. This was the true point of no return. Writing was one thing, sending was another. Once it left his hands, the story would no longer belong entirely to him.
It would exist in the space between two people who shared a past no one else could fully understand. Elvis thought about the empire built around him, how efficiently it functioned, how quickly it corrected deviation, how much of his life had been shaped by avoiding exactly this kind of risk. He knew if this letter were discovered, it would be seen as weakness, as instability, as something that needed to be managed. But for the first time, that fear felt smaller than the weight of doing nothing. The suspense peaked when Elvis stood up and walked toward the door. Each step felt deliberate, irreversible. This was not a dramatic escape. This was a quiet decision that would never make headlines, yet might matter more than anything else he ever did. He placed the envelope somewhere it could be sent without explanation, without ceremony. As he turned away, doubt tried one last time to pull him back. What if this changed nothing? What if the letter was ignored?
What if the risk outweighed the reward? But another thought answered just as clearly. Some actions are not meant to change the world. They are meant to change the person who takes them. That night, Elvis did not feel free. Freedom would come later, if at all. What he felt was alignment. The rare, unsettling feeling of living in the same direction as his conscience. The suspense shifted shape. It was no longer about what might happen to him. It was about what kind of man he would be, regardless of outcome. He went to bed knowing that the letter would leave his hands soon. That knowledge followed him into sleep. Heavy, but honest. Tomorrow, the machine would start again. Meetings, music, smiles, applause. The world would see the same king it always had. But something essential had changed beneath the surface. Because the most dangerous moment in Elvis Presley's life was not when the letter arrived. It was the moment he chose to answer it. And from that point on, there was no going back to who he had been before the truth demanded a response. After the letter left his hands, Elvis felt something unfamiliar settle into his days. Not relief, not fear, something quieter, a shift. Like the ground beneath him had moved slightly, just enough to make everything feel unstable but real. He did not tell anyone what he had done. He did not need to. The act itself had already changed the shape of his thoughts, and that change followed him everywhere. The machine kept running. Schedules remained packed. Cameras flashed. Applause roared on cue. To the outside world, nothing had happened. Elvis Presley was still the king. Still powerful. Still controlled. Still smiling. But inside that performance, something essential had broken free. Silence was no longer neutral. It had become heavy, intentional, and harder to carry. Every song felt different now, not because the notes had changed, but because he was no longer hiding from himself while singing them. Lyrics he had performed 100 times suddenly sounded like questions instead of entertainment. Words about love, loss, regret, and longing no longer felt abstract. They felt personal, almost confessional. Elvis wondered if the audience could sense it, or if this transformation existed only within him. The suspense of waiting replaced the suspense of deciding. Had the letter been received? Had it been opened? Had it been ignored? Each day without an answer stretched that tension further, and yet Elvis found that the waiting did not weaken him.
It sharpened him, because now the uncertainty came from honesty, not avoidance. He began to notice how much of his life had been designed to prevent exactly this kind of discomfort. Every distraction, every indulgence, every carefully managed chaos had served one purpose: to keep him from sitting still with his own thoughts. Now, those thoughts demanded space. They surfaced in quiet moments, between songs, late at night when the noise faded, and only memory remained. Elvis did not regret sending the letter. That realization surprised him. He had expected guilt or panic to follow. Instead, what followed was clarity. Not answers, but direction. He understood now that even if the world never knew, even if nothing external ever changed, something internal already had. He could no longer pretend ignorance. He had acknowledged the truth, and that acknowledgement reshaped how he saw every compromise he had made. The men around him sensed the difference, even if they could not name it. He was less pliable, less eager to agree, less willing to be rushed past his own instincts. It was subtle, but in a system built on predictability, subtle shifts are noticed quickly. Concern returned, conversations grew cautious. He was watched more closely now, measured for signs of instability. Elvis recognized the pattern. The empire had detected movement. The suspense deepened when Elvis realized how little room there was for a man like him to evolve. Growth was allowed only if it could be packaged, sold, and controlled. Anything else was seen as threat. And now he was carrying something that could not be monetized or explained away. A private truth, a moral reckoning, a decision made without permission. He thought often about the person who had written the original letter. He imagined them receiving his response, unfolding it with the same hesitation he had felt. He wondered what they would feel reading his words. Validation, pain, closure, or perhaps nothing at all.
That uncertainty no longer frightened him the way it once had. He had done his part. What came next was no longer his to manage. Days turned into weeks. No reply came. The silence stretched, but it felt different now. It was not oppressive. It was reflective. Elvis understood something important during that time. Closure does not always arrive in the form we expect. Sometimes it arrives as permission to move forward without erasing the past. The suspense shifted again, inward this time. Elvis began questioning other choices he had made, other moments where silence had seemed easier than truth. The letter had opened a door he could not close. Once a man confronts one lie, the others line up quietly, waiting their turn. This realization was unsettling, but it also felt honest. He saw his legacy more clearly now, not as a list of achievements, but as a collection of moments where he had chosen safety over self. The world would remember the music, the movies, the image, but Elvis now knew there was another story running beneath it all, a story of a man navigating power without freedom, love without ownership, and success without control. The letter had not destroyed him. That truth became undeniable. If anything, it had steadied him. It reminded him that even within a life built on performance, authenticity could still exist in small private acts. He did not need to tear down the empire to reclaim himself. He only needed to stop disappearing inside it.
One night after a performance, Elvis stood alone backstage longer than usual. The crowd's noise faded into distance. He felt tired but grounded. For the first time in a long while, exhaustion did not feel like emptiness. It felt earned. He thought about how close he had come to burning the letter, to erasing the discomfort before it could change him. That version of himself felt distant now, almost unrecognizable. The suspense that once threatened to consume him had transformed into something else: responsibility, awareness, choice. He understood now that the most dangerous moments in life are not the ones filled with chaos, but the quiet ones, where we decide who we are willing to be when no one is watching. Elvis never spoke publicly about the letter. History would never record it. Fans would never debate it. Biographers would never agree on it. And that was fine. Not every truth needs an audience. Some exist only to realign a soul. As he walked away from the stage that night, one thought stayed with him, clear and steady. The letter had come to remind him of who he had been. Answering it had allowed him to choose who he would become. And that choice, once made, continued shaping him long after the ink had dried. Because the power of the letter was never in its words. It was in what it awakened. And once awakened, Elvis Presley could never fully return to the silence that had once defined his life. The reply arrived without warning. No announcement, no explanation. Just another envelope, ordinary in every way, waiting among papers that no one else would ever care to read. Elvis recognized the handwriting instantly. His chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with recognition. The waiting had ended, and with it the illusion that this story could remain unfinished forever. He did not open it right away. That hesitation was deliberate. He needed to understand something first. Whatever was inside this envelope could not undo what he had already done. His reply had already crossed the line that mattered. This letter could offer closure, or it could reopen wounds, but it no longer controlled him the way the first one had. Still, when he finally unfolded the paper, the room felt smaller, quieter, as if the world itself was listening. The words were brief. There was no accusation, no demand, no attempt to pull him back into the past. Instead, the letter acknowledged receipt, acknowledged truth. It confirmed that the memory he had tried to outrun had not been imagined or exaggerated. It had been shared. And for the person who wrote it, that acknowledgement alone carried weight. Elvis felt something loosen inside him. Not happiness, not forgiveness, recognition. The kind that allows a person to breathe differently. The letter did not ask him to change his life. It did not ask him to make amends publicly. It simply accepted what he had offered and returned something he had not expected: understanding. The suspense of confrontation dissolved into something quieter and more complex. There would be no dramatic reckoning, no public collapse, no exposed scandal. The story would not end with destruction. It would end with truth exchanged privately, witnessed only by two people who shared a moment the world had never seen. That realization shifted how Elvis understood power. Control had taught him to fear exposure. Honesty taught him something else: that some truths are strongest when they are not performed. The silence that followed this exchange felt different from all the others he had lived with. It was not avoidance. It was completion. Elvis did not feel the need to hide the letter or revisit it constantly. Its work was done. The tension that had driven his thoughts for weeks softened into something steady. The suspense that once pushed him forward now released him gently. He began to notice how much of his exhaustion had come from carrying unresolved things, not fame itself, but the weight of unfinished truths. The letter had shown him that not every reckoning needed an audience. Some only needed courage and patience. That lesson stayed with him as he moved through his days, quieter but more present than before. The people around him never learned what had changed. They only sensed it. Elvis carried himself differently now. Not defiantly, not recklessly, just with less fear. Decisions came easier. Silence felt less oppressive. He no longer flinched at the thought of being remembered inaccurately, because he had finally been seen accurately by the one person who mattered in this story. The suspense shifted again, this time toward legacy. Elvis began to wonder how many other moments in his life had shaped him without ever being recorded, how many private truths lived behind public myths. He realized that history is not just written by what is revealed, but by what is quietly resolved. And in that sense, this letter had already done its work. He placed the reply with the original letter, not as evidence, but as closure. 2 pieces of paper that had altered his inner life more than any contract or performance ever had. He did not return to them often. He did not need to. Their presence was enough. They reminded him that honesty, once chosen, does not demand constant attention. It simply changes the direction of things. One evening, after a long performance, Elvis sat alone and felt something rare. Peace without numbness. He was still tired, still confined by expectations, still carrying the weight of a public life. But the inner conflict that had once consumed him had quieted. The letter had spoken back, and in doing so, it had taken something heavy with it. The story did not end with triumph or tragedy. It ended with alignment. The boy who had once spoken carelessly and the man who had learned to survive carefully had finally met somewhere in between. That meeting did not free him from his world, but it freed him within it. As Elvis folded the letters one last time and placed them away, he understood something that would stay with him. Destruction was never the letter's true power. Transformation was. And sometimes, the most meaningful changes in a life happen without witnesses, without applause, and without history ever knowing how close everything came to falling apart. Even after the letters were safely tucked away, Elvis could not escape the weight of memory. The past was no longer a place he could visit lightly. Every familiar room, every sound, every fleeting shadow reminded him of the choices he had made and the promises he had once spoken carelessly. Fame had always insulated him, giving him the illusion of control, but the letter had pierced that armor. It had revealed that control was never real. What he had called safety had always been compromise. Now, every step he took, every movement on stage, every handshake in a crowded room, carried the quiet gravity of a man reckoning with himself.
He remembered the first time he realized that success could not erase regret. It was not during a recording session or a press event, but late one night in a hotel room, long before the letters arrived. He had been staring at the ceiling, the music from the lobby faintly echoing, and the memory of a forgotten promise had returned, unbidden. He had imagined being a hero, a king with no faults. Yet that memory reminded him that the man beneath the crown was vulnerable, human, and prone to error. That vulnerability had always been manageable, until someone had reminded him through written words of what he had avoided for so long. The letters had forced him to confront the entirety of his life's trajectory. Every decision that seemed inconsequential suddenly carried weight. He thought of people he had ignored, relationships he had postponed, and the personal integrity he had sacrificed to protect an image. He realized that the empire around him had functioned precisely because he allowed it. The king's throne was real, but the man on it had often been absent from his own life. That absence, now illuminated by the letter, was uncomfortable but necessary. It demanded reflection. It demanded honesty. Even performing felt different now. Every note he sang seemed charged with a private tension, a subtle confession hidden within melody. Fans cheered, but they did not hear the weight behind each word. The world saw only perfection, not the human soul navigating the consequences of its choices. The suspense of secrecy lingered constantly, as though the letters themselves had infused the air around him with quiet demand. Elvis could not ignore it, even if no one else could see the transformation unfolding. The awareness of mortality began to mingle with the weight of memory. Time was finite, and the decisions left unmade were more real than any stage or audience ever could be. The letter had reminded him that some truths are unavoidable, no matter how deeply buried. Silence, he now understood, is a temporary shield, but truth is permanent. And once a truth is acknowledged, it begins to reshape the contours of a life, subtly but irreversibly. Elvis considered his own identity, something he had always believed was inseparable from fame, but the letters had reminded him that identity was more than a stage persona. It was a sum of private choices, memories, and promises kept or broken. The king was a role, the voice a tool, but the man was separate, fragile, flawed, and human. And for the first time, he considered the possibility that being true to that man was more important than the applause that followed him everywhere. Even as he moved through the routines of daily life, recording sessions, movie scripts, appearances, he could feel the quiet rebellion within him, not loud, not defiant, but present. Every decision, small or large, carried the awareness that he could choose differently. The letters had introduced the concept of personal sovereignty back into a life long governed by expectation. He understood now that silence could protect, but it could also imprison. Honesty carried risk, but it also carried freedom. Elvis could no longer look at the world the same way. His relationships, his choices, his career, all were refracted through the lens of the letters. He wondered if others could sense the subtle shift in him. Managers might notice a hesitation, a pause before a practiced answer. Friends might detect a depth of reflection previously absent.
But those observations, if they existed, mattered little. What mattered was the quiet knowledge that he had crossed a threshold. He had acknowledged something he could never unsee. The letters had done more than illuminate his past. They had created a tension for the future. Decisions would now carry additional weight. Every choice he made would be informed by the man he had remembered himself to be. He felt accountable in a way he had never allowed before. The empire could continue, but its control over him had loosened. He understood the precarious balance between fame and self, and he began navigating it with a cautious but determined awareness. In the stillness of the night, Elvis allowed himself a rare thought. Maybe the letters had been the most important performance of all. Not the shows, not the recordings, not the public triumphs, but the act of facing a personal truth and responding honestly. That act, he realized, required more courage than any audience or manager had ever demanded. And as he lay down, the suspense of possibility lingered, quiet but persistent, a reminder that some stories are never fully complete until the choices of the present reconcile with the truths of the past. Time passed, seasons changed. The world continued indifferent to the private reckoning of one man. Elvis Presley remained a legend in the public eye. Crowds cheered, cameras flashed, headlines praised the king, oblivious to the deeper journey he had taken. Yet inside, something fundamental had shifted. He had crossed a line no one could see, yet it defined every moment afterward. The letters had rewritten the rules of his inner life. They had returned ownership of the man beneath the fame to the man himself. He felt the weight of that choice every morning, not as burden, but as responsibility. Elvis recognized that living authentically required vigilance. Fame would always demand compromise, always impose narratives, always manipulate perception. But now he knew that he could navigate these pressures without surrendering the truth of who he was. That knowledge made every performance feel simultaneously lighter and heavier. Lighter because he no longer pretended entirely, heavier because he carried the awareness of what integrity truly required. Elvis began to make subtle changes. Conversations became honest where previously he would have nodded politely. Decisions were informed by personal judgment rather than automatic compliance. Not all of them were revolutionary, but each small act accumulated, reshaping the environment around him. The men who had once managed his silence noticed it, yet could not define or suppress it. A king had returned to himself, and no empire could fully dictate the choices of a man who remembered his own voice. He reflected often on the power of patience. The letters had been years in the making, delivered at precisely the moment when he could confront the truths he had avoided. They had reminded him that sometimes life waits until a person is ready, until the consequences of avoidance become clearer than the consequences of action. That understanding shifted his relationship with time. He no longer rushed to hide flaws or cover mistakes. He allowed them to exist, studied them, and integrated their lessons.
Performance itself transformed. Elvis's music, once designed to entertain and distract, now carried weight he could not deny. Audiences felt it, even unconsciously.
Every note resonated with experience, regret, and understanding. The king had not lost his showmanship, he had infused it with depth. Suspense lived not in what he sang, but in what he no longer hid. Those who listened closely sensed a vulnerability that was previously absent, a human presence beneath the legend. The letters also reshaped his relationships. He approached friends and family with renewed honesty. He examined old grievances, resolved what he could, and learned to accept what could not be changed. The act of responding to a single truth had expanded his capacity for empathy and understanding. The world had not changed, but he had, and sometimes that is all that is necessary. Elvis realized that the most powerful impact of the letters was internal. Fame had constructed a narrative for him, but the letters reconstructed the narrative within him. Control, image, and expectation remained external pressures, but the internal kingdom, the man himself, was no longer negotiable. That was a subtle but radical victory. He understood finally that the truest audience is oneself. Years later, he would occasionally revisit the letters, not to read, but to feel. They were reminders of a moment when he chose authenticity over safety, courage over ease, a private victory that had altered everything. He understood that the world would never know, and he no longer needed it to. The act itself was sufficient, proof that some truths exist not for spectators, but for survival. The suspense that had defined the initial arrival of the letter had transformed into something lasting. Not anxiety, but awareness. Not fear, but presence. Elvis carried that awareness in every interaction, every note, every performance. It was subtle, invisible to the casual observer, but foundational to the life he lived from that point forward. And so, the king who once measured his life in applause now measured it in integrity. He had confronted the past, acknowledged truth, and reclaimed himself. Fame could continue to surround him, contracts could dictate schedules, managers could advise and direct, but the most important story, the story of Elvis Presley as a man, had finally been written honestly. The letter that could have destroyed him did not. Instead, it awakened him. It reminded him that power is fleeting, image is fragile, and legacy is often misunderstood. What endures, what truly shapes a life, is courage, honesty, and the quiet decision to answer truth when it calls, not for the world, but for oneself. And in that, Elvis Presley was free.